everybody out there. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Rainy Cajun. My name is Jeremy, and I'm joined by my cousin David. Hi, David. How you doing?
Hey, good. How are you?
I'm good. Today we've actually got a really great interview lined up with you. I can't really stress enough the things that I've learned from this gentleman just in the brief discussions that we've had with him. And he has had quite a bit of time documenting and researching what Cajun life is like in not only modern times, but as it relates to historical times. So David introduced us all together, and thank you, David, for bringing him on. How did you meet Shane?
Well, actually, this will be the first time I'm actually talking to him in person other than through emails. So during my Cajun discovery, or whatever you want to call it, when I was looking at more of the cultural aspects instead of just the genealogy, I got along on a forum, the old forums on the internet, and there was one about Vacherie, and it started getting me asking the question from Vacherie, are we really Cajun or Creole? Because it's so easy for media, especially, well, I guess maybe since forever, but at least from the 60s and 70s and 80s to categorize what Cajun and Creole traits are. And so, I was looking around trying to find out some histories, both foodways and just in general discovering our background. And I saw this book was being recommended by Amazon, I think, was the Cajuns, the Americanization of the People, and by a guy named Shane K. Bernard. And so I think I recently was looking through my copy of the book and realized I still had the receipt. So it was like 2008. It must have been Christmas time because it was December. But anyway, when I was reading these books, especially the Cajuns by Shane Bernard, I started really recognizing a lot of traits that you and I grew up with that I would not have necessarily have called, a shared experience with Cajun people. As I read the book, I start realizing, I was like, wow, I do qualify as a Cajun based on his descriptions. And in addition to the genealogy and the DNA that we've talked about with our Guidry line that came directly from Nova Scotia. I mean, he's over 30 years of historian, trained. I think he's got a PhD from Texas A&M in history, and he full-time. He's been working as a historian, an archivist, I guess, at Tabasco. And I really was excited that he was agreeing to talk to us because, like I said, that book meant a lot to me from a standpoint of just revelation or recognition of the traits that we had. So I look forward to talking to him. So.
Well, great. Let's go ahead and bring him in, and let's get down to it. And one quick thing, just so you stick around. David's got a 150-year-old-ish recipe of gumbo to share with us. Yep. So if you're looking for a slightly different take on what it is, I mean, this being an episode about historical Cajuns, you definitely want to stick around for that. So we'll get to that after our interview with Shane. So let's go ahead and bring him in.
All right.
What got you into wanting to document for Cajun culture, Cajun living in South Louisiana? What got you into wanting to write the books in the first place?
Well, I like writing. I mean, it can sometimes be a love-hate relationship,
right?
But I find if I don't write every few days, I just start to get really antsy and feeling like I need a writing fix. The way I got into history was through genealogy, and the way I got into genealogy was listening to my grandparents talk about family history. So of my two sets of grandparents, one was Cajun and one was Anglo-Saxon Scots from Mississippi. And that's because my mom is from Magnolia, Mississippi. My father is from Opelousas. My mother's family, that is her parents, moved from Mississippi to Lafayette in the 1950s because my grandfather was in the pharmaceutical business and was what they call a detail man. He would go around to all the doctors' offices and pharmacists in South Central Louisiana. And somehow my Anglo mom met my Cajun dad, and they fell in love and got married in the early 1960s. So I don't consider myself a half Cajun because of that, because I think Cajuns by their very nature are a mixture of ethnic groups to begin with. So sure. It's really par for the course. So I would ask my grandparents stories about our family history. And really, I would say that my Mississippi grandparents are the ones who started telling me these stories on their own. And then I began to find them of interest and started asking more questions, not only of them, but of my Cajun grandparents too, who lived in Opelousas. That kind of pushed me toward genealogy because fortunately, Cajuns being Catholics, the Catholic Church kept such meticulous records going back many hundreds of years. And so in high school, I started going to the Lafayette Parish Public Library and using its genealogy section. I found it was fairly easy to trace your ancestry back to the early 1600s and in some instances the late 1500s. And oddly enough, the hardest part of doing that was the first 100 years. If you could find out the name of your great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, after that it became relatively easy because there were Father Hebert's books, Donald Hebert's books, Southwest records that started at that time. I don't remember where they cut off now, but if you could get back to around 1900, it was very easy from that point on to go back in Louisiana to the early to mid 18th century, and then you skip to Bona Arsenault's books and go back to the early 1600s, late 1500s. And now it's probably completely different because there's so many more sources to consult, and so much of it is digital, whereas back then it was all hard copy books that you had to consult.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say that. So you and I I think I'm about a year or two younger than you. And I started around the same time. So Jeremy and I, obviously with the last name of Hubble, that's not very Cajun. We had our grandfather and grandmother were from St. James Parish. And so they were living in Metairie when we were growing up. And they had been since like the 1930s. And as I was younger, they had a lot of pictures on the wall in one of the bedrooms of their parents and their siblings. And there was a newspaper of a cyclone that killed my great-grandfather, Arthur Hubble, in Vacherie back in 1924. So I remembered seeing those. We were living in Texas, and so we'd come and visit, and I'd see those papers, and I'd get curious. And then one of our dad's cousins, Jim Harris, ended up sharing with us a pedigree chart where we kind of only took the Hubbles back to about the 1820s or so. And I was always kind of questioning, and I started really finding out more about them when I was a teenager, also around 1984. And I'd ask the questions, and my grandparents had provided my dad some information that I had. And then I ended up taking that, and there was a guy that I thought he only just published in the Times-Picayune, but I think he went throughout South Louisiana where you could put a query in for genealogy. And I did that. And I found that all of a sudden I listed all my parents, my grandparents and my great grandparents. I had their names. And once I mailed that out, I think it was right after our grandfather died in 1985. I'd start getting all these wonderful letters from all these folks who were in their 80s at the time with full pedigree charts and list of all the names. And they remembered my grandparents on either side. And it was just for those, just exactly how you described it, because being 300 years of Catholic in South Louisiana and the meticulous records, these people had been doing it all by hand through the books. And then I joined the German Acadian Coast Genealogy, I think it's History and Genealogy Society, or vice versa, out of Laplace. And I may be one of the oldest members because I think they started in about 84, 85, and I've pretty much kept up my subscription to it these last 40 years. And so that got me interested in it. But even at that point, I really wasn't sure of, I guess I always knew we were French and German. And oddly enough, my grandfather told us, I remember as a kid around our Grandpa Hubble, he said, yeah, we're Scotch Irish, which I thought was kind of, how did he know? Because there's a whole deal where our Hubble ancestor came from New Jersey or New York, and he ended up in New Orleans, and him and a young German girl ended up coming to Mobile, oddly enough, and got married in the Catholic Church, then ended up back in New Orleans. And that's how our whole group of Hubbles started. And they intermarried with a lot of the Wagaspaks and the Hemels. And our grandmother was a Pye from St. James Parish, but her grandmother and her whole lineage was Guidry's. So, anyway, that's really our kind of, I could trace back our Cajun ancestry through our grandmother specifically with the Guidry family.
As I mentioned to you through email, I went to school with some Hubbles in Lafayette.
Okay, yeah. And those Hubbles actually were probably Dr. Jerry Hubble's kids. There's probably another David Hubble there. And I think they had another sister or something, but they also came from Vacherie. So those would have been our second cousins. Yeah. So as I started getting into it more and more, I was isolated at thinking it in terms of like certain countries, but it wasn't until I got a little older, and then the 1980s, the whole Cajun Creole craze came out. And
exactly. Yeah.
And so that's probably about this, like I said, we were probably doing those type of research around the same time, and I guess finding somewhat similar, our respective histories around that time.
Well, as I look back at it, and really, I well remember in the 1970s, I think it was around 1977 or 78, ironically, my Mississippi grandfather gave me a copy of William Faulkner Rushton's book, The Cajuns. And I read that book and found it very interesting. Rushton, I like him. I like his writing, but he put forth this theory of a second expulsion that happened along the Mississippi River, that Anglo planters came by and started buying up land and even sort of forcing the Cajuns along the Mississippi to sell out. And other historians have pointed out that never really happened. But before that idea was debunked, it was taken seriously because it appeared in print in this book. But it nonetheless got me interested. One of the things that got me interested in Cajuns, the strange thing though is, when I look at myself, there's nothing particularly Cajun about me. I don't have a Cajun accent. I don't like to hunt and fish. I don't do all the sort of stereotypical things that Cajuns do. I listen to classic rock and classical music, not so much Cajun music, although I have gone through periods of listening to Cajun music, and I certainly have a pretty big collection of it. That in itself doesn't bother me.
Right.
I am the person I turned out to be. I don't really feel like I have to do anything to be Cajun or to prove myself Cajun. And yet I still feel compelled to study the Cajun people. And part of the reason why, as I explain in that third book of mine, The Cajuns, Americanization of a People, why did I turn out the way that I did? Why is it that my grandparents in Opelousas spoke French and English, and in the case of my grandmother there, spoke French before she knew how to speak English? Why is it they were bilingual and I wasn't? And my father wasn't either, my Cajun father, but at least he could sing a number of songs in French. Yeah. I think he knew more French than he let on, because occasionally I found him using a word or a phrase that I was surprised that he knew. He told me about the time that in the 50s, when he moved to East Texas, to the Liberty or Winnie, Texas area, because my grandfather had moved there to work in the oil business, building board roads or something like that. That the local Texas kids at first made fun of him because some of the words he used were French words for things, and Dad didn't know that. Dad just thought everybody called this or that by this word that he didn't even know it was French, you know? So that's not the same as putting complete sentences or having conversations in French. He was called to talk to this woman because a friend of Dad's thought, well, he's Rod Bernard, the singer, the swamp pop singer who sings Kalinda and some other songs in French and English. He must speak French. Well, when Dad got to the hospital to talk to this elderly woman, Dad realized, oh, they want me to tell her something in French. Well, I don't think I can do that. Well, I can try. And so Dad was supposed to tell the woman that a relative of hers passed away, but instead he accidentally told her that her relative was drunk. I work for McElhenney Company, the folks that make Tabasco brand pepper sauce on Avery Island. I've been there 31 years now. And Walter McElhenney, who ran the company from 1949 to 85 when he passed away, he was in World War II. Decidedly not Cajun, but arguably a French Creole, because his mother descended from the Branger planter family near New Orleans. And from that connection, he grew up speaking Louisiana French with a sort of New Orleans French flair. And when he was in the Pacific fighting in World War II as a major, he contracted malaria, and for a time really kind of went out of his mind. And he at one point grabbed a pistol and started shooting at these imaginary Japanese soldiers, but he was cursing them out in Louisiana French. And when he had an opportunity in Australia or New Zealand to record a message to his mother through the Red Cross, and it was sent to her through the mail on a 78 RPM disc, he was speaking to her in French. And I had a translator in New Orleans translate it for me. And that's when they noted that he was speaking a patois that is associated with New Orleans.
Jeremy and our grandmother, Marie, what I found interesting is that there's an incident that we talked about before, that sometime in the early 80s, their house got broken into and they had come back from someplace. And I remember her telling my dad the story that they had gotten to the back door and all of a sudden they realized there was something amiss. And so she says, so I talked to your dad in French. And my thought was, hell, I didn't know she'd know how to speak French. And I came to learn later that that was her first language till she was 6. She was born in 1910, end of 1910. But she and all the folks up and down, like I said, in the Vacherie area and St. James area that was their first language. And by the time we were coming up, they still use some of the terms every so often. Of course, I got called a couillon many times by my mom. Then, talking about looking cagu, if you ever heard that term. The tire-bouchon, to open a bottle opener. Trying to think of what they call it, pochon, chamber pot. Didn't learn till I looked at how it was spelt, what it was really referencing. And some of those words I read through was one of the other priests that did the Cajun French, learned Cajun French book. And I was going through all the different words and listening and reading them. And all of a sudden I started having all these memories come back that I'd heard these terms before, but I didn't realize, or I'd forgotten them. But then all of a sudden it made perfect sense what they meant all these years later when I saw them in writing. I was going to say that's kind of the same sort of memories that we have, that I had. And they didn't speak a lot of French, but their generation would have been, I guess, between your dad and what year was your dad born?
40.
Okay. So my parents were born in 43 and 46. So my grandparents were early 19 1907, 1910 on the Hubble side, and 1921 and 23 on the Robert side. So they would have been in that era where there was still French at the house, I guess. But like you talked about in your book, also at the schools, they were kind of being, I guess, encouraged not to speak that.
I was born in 1967, and I grew up in Ivanhoe subdivision in on the south side of Lafayette, which ironically, or maybe fittingly, all the streets were named after characters from Sir Walter Scott novels. And or so I assume. I grew up on Mannering. Loxley was another street. I forget some of the others. One word that all the kids in the neighborhood used to use, when they wanted to say I'd be embarrassed or I'd be ashamed, they'd say I'd be haunt, Yeah. And we didn't know that was a French word,
Mm-hmm.
but somehow that had been passed down to us as a word, and you'd hear it around the neighborhood and on the school ground. But unfortunately, words like that were very few and far between, at least for me, where I grew up. Looking back, most of my friends, not all of them, but most of them were Cajuns or Creoles. And yet none of us spoke French, at least not that I know of. Certainly the ones I've kept in touch with since childhood, none of us spoke French. And what French I know now, I learned in high school and college, or I taught myself later using things like Duolingo.
Yeah, that's actually, I'm doing that right now.
Yeah. So I describe myself as hopelessly intermediate when it comes to French speaking skills. And I really envy people who either got to go to French immersion like my two children did. It really took with my daughter. She speaks French. I don't know if it sounds to me fluent, but let's say near fluent French.
Mm-hmm.
I also envy people who have a knack for language, and I just don't have a knack for non-English languages. What French I know, I really had to struggle to learn because it's just not easy for me to pick up.
I was gonna say, I'm trying to remember if I've seen conversations between you and Joseph Dunn, who works at Laura Plantation.
Yeah, I know Joseph very well.
Okay, yeah. So Joseph, he amazes me with, his, he's par excellence. He's just way up there when it comes to the French skills. And a distant cousin of ours who works there is also Jay Scheck-Snyder. And Jay's about 10 years younger than me. And I remember asking Jay when I first met him, because he had the accent, but he could speak the language. And he said, well, he had the benefit of the fact that his grandmother, or actually spent a lot of time with his great grandmother, who was still living basically in that area. And that's basically all she spoke. And he said between that and even listening to, and I don't know how many stations are still around other than KRVS having the French broadcast, but he would listen to those between Cajun music or the Cajun announcers on the radio, and just he picked it up. And I guess that would be the natural way you would pick up a language anyway. So I've tried to impart some of those skills or techniques, I should say, because I'll try to listen to a little bit of the KRVS in the mornings, and I can usually follow along with what they're saying. I don't think I could reproduce if I was trying to speak it. That'd be the issue. But I think I know enough that I could at least kind of figure out what they're talking about. But that's just some of the techniques I've been trying to see, because like I said, in my 50s, I don't think I'll ever be above just under intermediate in my case.
If I were suddenly transported and dropped off in the middle of Paris, I could certainly find my way around, but I couldn't have an intellectual discussion. I can ask where the bathroom is and please bring me a glass of water and stuff like that. In fact, I took my kids to France about 4 years ago, and whenever I got stuck, I would just reach for my daughter and say, Colette, come talk to these people, please. But yeah, she started French immersion in kindergarten and remained in it until the 5th or 6th grade, and really retained a huge amount of what she learned. My son was in it too, but his skill level is about the same as mine. because he left French immersion. I think it was in the third or fourth grade, because he just didn't take to it like my daughter did.
So you talked about your grandfather bringing the family to East Texas for a while, and I know you went to Texas A&M for your PhD work. And like I said, I grew up in Houston, and there's a lot of times that I guess I didn't realize the stretch or the influence or that the descendants, the Cajuns, had really made as far as spreading out that way. Because my coach in high school is a guy named Warren Trahan. But my parents, I remember them telling me, okay, well, he's Cajun. He's from South Louisiana. And it just kind of was amazing to me. But I mean, I had kids in the school, and I mean, we had Heberts, LeBlancs, Daigles, and I didn't know, I couldn't have told you, what those names were versus any other names from there. And then I moved later we moved to Mobile. And of course, we have a lot more of the Creole influence, French Creoles from the past. And especially after Katrina, we started seeing more of the people that, you can tell were from various parts of inward Louisiana, but they're still probably more closer to North Shore and New Orleans area. But then even our great grandfather, he worked for I think it was Burton Schwartz Lumber Company in St. James. And after I think they finished cutting down a lot of the lumber out there, they moved out toward past Tallahassee. And I found an article online describing the fact that they had gone over there and they basically were calling them Cajuns growing up. It's like that whole culture or whole group of people went over there. So I know Jeremy visited our great uncle at the time out there, and I hadn't been that far there, but I think it would be interesting to see how that culture carried on over there, if there's still any remnants of it in that area. Mm-hmm. But I was just amazed, like I said, that you think about it, and I guess the media, popular media, always tries to fixate and put it into a special little box that it's only in this particular area, and all Cajuns are the same, and all Cajun food is the same. But yet, when you really look at it and study it, like your book talked about, you realize the diversity amongst and the widespread footprint that we've had. But Jeremy, have you encountered that? Because Jeremy, you've lived in California and in Washington State. I mean, do you see a lot of folks from South Louisiana that you've come in contact with, or Cajuns?
More than I expected. You do meet some people from Louisiana, and I've been here far longer than I was in California, so I didn't really get a chance to know people in California that could have been from Louisiana, but definitely up here. So there's actually a grocery store here that the gentleman that runs it is he's from the North Shore. He set up shop here. He wasn't a grocer originally, but he has now worked with food manufacturers in Scott and various parts of Acadiana, and then also, New Orleans and whatnot, to bring in groceries from Louisiana, things that were nearly impossible to get in the past. And there is now they call it a Cajun festival, but I mean, but there is a distinct subset of the population up here, more than I would have thought, being this far north and west of Louisiana. Would you experience that? But to be honest with you, I used to travel, I commuted to Tokyo once a month in the early 2000s, and I bumped into a lot of people from Louisiana in Tokyo.
Wow.
Who would have thought? Who would have thought? So, and there was a guy who actually ran a restaurant. He had a $30 fried shrimp dinner that consisted of 6 shrimp. Wow. And that's how he could afford to run a business in Tokyo. But he was always packed every single night. He was packed. He only had to open Thursday through Sunday or Wednesday through Saturday, something like that, because he was packed every night. So there was a demand for that kind of food, and the culture aspect of it. That's the part that frankly I don't see enough of outside of Louisiana because of the food phenomena that happened in the 80s with Paul Prudhomme and Kay Pauls, and then of course Emerald kind of swooped in behind him, and they have popularized Cajun food. But I don't, in my limited research that I've done, and certainly David with our experience, talking with each other and going to the boucherie last February, it's not, black and red fish is not, something that is Cajun. And so, people think, if you put this inside your dish, you are making a Cajun dish. And that is a stereotype that perpetuates throughout the world now. That's the part that, frankly, it concerns me. Cajun has taken its place on, not center stage, but it is taking its place among the ranks of when people categorize food. You've got,
you're absolutely
right. And so has New Orleans. There's not many places that you can associate with food. So for that, I'm grateful that at least that calls some attention to the historical component that makes up the region. But at the same time, I'm also concerned that it's become something that it's truly not. Is it even worth trying to change course, or is this basically set, right? And we should just accept that at least we have an identity in the culinary world, right? Or is this something that we should be working towards trying to slightly, correct and morph people's opinions about what is Cajun Creole, trying to even just the New Orleans style food versus Cajun versus Creole. Everybody kind of lumps it in together unless you're living inside the region. So is it worth it? Or should we just be happy that the fact that people even know it exists?
Well, I used to get, especially in the 1990s, I used to get really angry at the media and pop culture, and even the tourism industry for twisting what Cajun and Creole culture was all about. And really, those institutions really ignored everything Creole and just latched onto Cajun.
Right.
And that in itself is an issue, because a lot of what was being called Cajun was actually Creole, or it was Cajun and Creole. Yeah, there was something about writing that book, The Cajuns' Americanization of a People, and looking at the way Cajun food and culture in general was being misrepresented, especially in the 80s when you had that Cajun fad. That's when it really peaked.
Right.
I was able to get that off my chest, and now I just kind of find it mildly humorous. It doesn't really bother me anymore. But on the other hand, it's hardly as bad as it was in the 80s. In the 80s, it was just horrible.
Yeah.
With Cajuns showing up in movies and on TV shows with just left and right with these horrible accents.
Oh, God. Yeah, the Big Easy. You remember that movie?
Yes. I went to Big Easy in a movie theater, and people were laughing, I don't think that would have been the case in any movie theater outside of South Louisiana, East Texas, because they wouldn't have known that this was like a really bad Cajun accent, or that there weren't that many telltale Cajuns in Metro New Orleans. That was a big pet peeve of mine too, was the media and the tourism industry depicting New Orleans as the center of the Cajun universe. I even wrote a letter to National Geographic one time, because they had done, I don't remember if it was a story about New Orleans or about Cajuns. I know they've done stories about both during that time period. But there was one line in a story that Cajuns are part of the cultural gumbo that makes up New Orleans. And I wrote to them and I said, look, that's not really true. If you look at the 1990 census records, only about 1% of Orleans Parish residents, Orleans Parish and New Orleans being the same thing, really, only about 1% listed themselves as Cajun, meaning that German Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans in New Orleans all greatly outnumber the number of people who identified as Cajun by many times over. And the one statistic I love the most, and with your Houston connection, I think you'll like this, is that if you look at how many Cajuns in 1990 were in Metro Houston, Harris County, Texas, it was roughly the same percentage as Cajuns in Orleans Parish, Metro New Orleans. Yeah. But on a per capita basis, it was something like 1.5 times, or maybe it was 4.5 times as many Cajuns on a per capita basis in Metro Houston. And yet nobody ran around saying that Houston was the center of the Cajun universe because it had more Cajuns in New Orleans. But then, like I said, eventually I just sort of learned to laugh at all of that.
And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on, was because of this, because you have a lot more background than both of us do, and so it helps educate people. And I just watched your episode with that gal from New York. Yeah. And I just, and I was, you were talking about some of the similar things about the Cajuns and Creoles and people really not fully understanding the relationship between the two cultures and one being an offshoot of the other or vice versa. There was just there's a lot of misconceptions, I believe, that you were pointing out. I don't want to say it's a letdown, but it's certainly, it's something where I'm like, well, does this mean anything to any of you people? So I guess my point is, the thing that probably is the most concerning to me is that as the culture, as you put it, Shane, the Americanization of the Cajun culture continues, how much of the historical record and how much of the historical significance that those people brought to the region will eventually just fade away, and it will be just a distant memory, and it won't really have any meaning or significance.
If you're studying an ethnic group, you fall into the trap of ancestor worship, and you see this with a lot of early historical profession in America, because a lot of historians in the early days of the field were sort of well-to-do Northeasterners who were studying the founding fathers and the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and they weren't very critical because these were their ancestors.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was only later that later generations of historians pointed out that, look, a lot of these early works are basically, hagiographic or hagiographic. They're deifying their ancestors and not really getting at the real truth of what these people were really like. Not that they were horrible people, but they're people. And so I don't want to do that with the subjects that I study.
I was going to say, I think that your technique of doing that, especially like in the book on the Cajuns, for me in particular, I think it works not as an activism per se, but there's the general awakening of understanding. Like I said, we knew that we had certain countries in our ancestry, but it wasn't until I looked at it kind of as the way you had presented it in terms of, this is what certain people were doing in the 40s and 50s. And I looked back and I said, well, heck, my grandparents were doing that, or they grew up that way. And of course, in looking at the 22 parishes of the Acadiana and saying, well, they fell into that. And then realizing, like you also point out from a genealogical standpoint, that there is not a purebred Cajun anymore, because of the fact that they had all intermarried. But yet we can trace certain elements of our ancestry back to Canada, Nova Scotia, Acadiana, excuse me, or Acadia. But so that technique in and of itself, to me, works, because I think what you're trying to do is also you're present an observation, and if somebody's genuinely interested in learning the truth of history and the ways about it, you're going to read different points of view, and hopefully you'll contemplate and think about it. And so to your point, when I'm talking about like the foods, oftentimes what I asked you in the past about Meliton, and then the other group I've been involved with is this Royal Order of Gumbo in Mobile that these guys had started. And what I find is oftentimes, especially the wonderful world of social media, there's a lot of opinions and things thrown around of what should go in a gumbo, what shouldn't go in a gumbo, what's the right boudin, all these type of things. And as I think I'm always trying to connect back to my past and to my ancestors. And so part of the way I do that is through food, looking at these traditional recipes that were more popular maybe along the river parishes, and even in early New Orleans when some of our ancestors were there. And as I try to research what I can from mostly newspapers at this point, or some old books, cookbooks, which you also realize have some flaws in them too. But then you start seeing how things were presented or how they were made in the past. And then you point out to people, well, yeah, people do use tomatoes and gumbos, or it was more of a Creole dish then, and there, celery wasn't always available to put in a trinity and those type of things, because there's people, because their grandparents, and I think you mentioned this either in your book or in one of your interviews, because their grandparents told them this is how it's done. Now all of a sudden you throw into question the authority that these grandparents or parents had to dispense this information, but they themselves really weren't educated any differently and didn't know a difference. So it's not that we're saying that they're wrong. It's just pointing out a broader point that no, there's no absolute recipe for this particular thing, and everybody's family probably did a little differently. Part of the thing I think for it to thrive is to just once again be educated and learn as much as you can. And as like you talked about early on, as more and more documentation's coming out, that can even change a narrative of when certain events were understood to have occurred. And that's the point that, I think that with a lot of people today, there's so many absolutes on things that, you have to, I just hope as people are encountering these things, and obviously social media for a lot of people are how they're getting their information, which is not a good thing. But, hopefully they're learning to discern between getting mixed messages and really want to learn and not just accepting, now, if my grandmother's recipe is the only gumbo recipe I've ever had, and that's the way I prefer it, then there's nothing wrong with that. If your gumbo recipe is different than mine, I recognize it as, I will recognize it as gumbo, but it may not have the same taste profile I prefer. But that doesn't mean that that either one of ours is the correct way. And it's just, I think the main thing is that trying to educate people in enough of a way just to say, here's a little history on it. And if you look at the old recipes, there weren't celery available. There wasn't often roux at all. And, and just because okra, the word for okra is kingambo from the Bantu word, doesn't necessarily mean that every gumbo had that, because you had the sassafras available in South Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. And then you think of things seasonally, when things were grown and when they were available. So if you wanted to have a gumbo in the middle of winter, I don't know whether okra was dried out and reused or pounded and made into a powder. So you have to just look at all those things and think about it and really wonder I don't think we can find the big bang of okra, of gumbo, in that sense, where you can definitively say this is the day gumbo was invented. It was an evolution of things, and you have to look at all the different groups that came in and influenced that and other Cajun dishes that we appreciate today. So,
yeah,
but I think the main thing is just education.
New evidence always shows up, even though the subject matter, for instance, gumbo, is nothing new. New evidence can show up, such as, for example, that reference rather to gumbo from 1764. It was sitting there the whole time, but it was only discovered, I don't know, 15 years ago, and it turned out to be very important to people who were interested in Cajuns and Creoles and cultural history, because the important thing about that reference is, as much as gumbo is associated with Creoles, rather with Cajuns, that reference to it being in Louisiana came from the very same year that the first Acadian exiles landed in the colony. And it certainly wasn't because of their arrival that it showed up in that record. Clearly it was already established in Louisiana. What you had, in fact, were a couple of enslaved people of African descent who were being interrogated over the theft of some food items. They admitted during the interrogation that they had collected these food items to make a gumbo. And that's the reference right there. So, we know that that there was something called gumbo in Louisiana as early as the same year the Acadians showed up, that apparently had nothing to do with them showing up. There are also, in addition to new evidence, there are new ways of looking at old subjects. And that explains why, for example, people are always writing new biographies of George Washington, for example. Well, you would think, do we really need that? Somebody wrote 83. Why isn't that one any good? It's because new evidence shows up, but also there are new ways of looking at things. And often our history, the way we write history, says as much about our age as the age that we're studying in that history book. But, this idea of looking at Cajuns as a type of Creole, even though I mentioned that you have references to that in the 1800s, it seemed to have disappeared for many generations and now is becoming very common and sort of catching on again. And also, as far as South Louisiana culinary history, this idea of thinking that, well, the difference between this gumbo and that gumbo is not so much a Cajun Creole split, but an urban rural split. Because, the gumbo in New Orleans is not like the gumbo made in Carencro, but, you've got Cajuns in Carencro and Creoles in Carencro, rural or small town Creoles, as opposed to urban Creoles in New Orleans. They're making gumbo in Carencro, and there's not much difference, if any, between Cajun gumbo and Creole gumbo in Carencro. So it seems to be more of an urban-rural split than a Cajun Creole split. So that's just a new way of looking at the issue, and that's why history continues to develop and is never really settled.
Right. I think is the woman Gwendolyn Menlo Hall? Is that her name?
Gwendolyn Menlo Hall. She's the one who found the reference in the Spanish colonial records in New Orleans to that gumbo being prepared in, or at least the plan was to prepare it before the people tested in 1764.
Yeah. I've like I said, I've used that reference with the gumbo group, and then we have an old cookbook in Mobile that was written in 1878, and they have a jambalaya and several gumbo recipes actually, And that kind of predates some of the New Orleans or Louisiana cookbooks. And so everybody's like jumping on, well, it was invented in Mobile. And I kind of ride the fence on it because, I like to remind people that in the early 1700s, Mobile was the first capital of French colonial Louisiana. And we had the same groups that were here that eventually ended up in New Orleans. But it's somewhere in Louisiana, but Louisiana back then was anywhere from Mobile to past New Orleans. And so it's just, like you said, different ways of thinking of it and different ways of looking at the history. We don't have anybody, like I told somebody on a podcast interview, nobody took a selfie that first day when they made the thing at Gumbo and posted it that, we invented it today.
What do you have planned now? I mean, your last book was what, 2017?
Yeah, it was the Tesh book. Yeah.
So what's next for you? So you like to write, so
there's a publisher approached me a couple of weeks ago about the possibility of translating the Americanization book into French and his company publishing it. I don't know if that'll happen or not. And it's kind of out of my hands anyway. Mm-hmm. But I've been working on 2 books at the same time. And they're both about South Louisiana history and culture. One I'm still working on. The other one is pretty much finished. But I find my blog as a very convenient outlet for a lot of shorter works.
Right.
That in the past, before social media and blogs, the only place there would have been to publish it would have been in academic journals. And those are notoriously slow in getting these articles. You may have to wait 3 years for something to appear in print. Whereas with social media, you can write it and put it on instantly. I mean, there are drawbacks to that because you're not going through blind peer review and all of that.
Right.
So what I usually do is I usually get people like Carl Brazo and Barry Ossolet and other people whose opinions I know and trust to critique it for me before I put it online. And you'll see that I often thank them for doing so.
That's a good point. I mean, like, I know Jeremy will be able to link the your blog post to the show notes in the on the YouTube channel. The other thing I was going to say is, so when I bought your book back in 2000, let me get it in the camera here, 2008. The other book I bought actually was called Stir the Pot, which has got Carl and his sons. So it's got Marcel Bienvenu and Carl and his son Ryan. And that was a good combination to me to read together. They support each other. And if you've had similar histories like we have had, or your parents had, maybe, then you may recognize a lot of things in your own past and realize that you were actually maybe more Cajun than you thought you were, or maybe less. But
yeah. Well, Shane, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Wow. Okay. That was amazing. Shane is he has such a wealth of knowledge. I feel like we're just scratching the surface with him. And
he's got so many interests in what he does out there. It's amazing.
Yeah. All right. So as promised, I want to talk about this gumbo recipe that you found that is pretty dang old. It's almost 150 years old, I believe.
Right.
And you put it on your site, and we'll provide a link to that down below here. But tell me about this recipe. What's it about? What goes into it? How close is it to modern gumbo? How different is it? And what's it taste like?
Okay, well, first thing I need to kind of preface is that the cookbook is called the Gulf Cities Cookbook from 1878. And it was from the ladies, the St. Francis Street Methodist Episcopal Church in Mobile. So I know right there, everybody's saying, whoa, wait a second, gumbo in Mobile, Alabama. But as we've talked about in the past, Mobile's history is first, the capital of French colonial Louisiana. Yep. So back then, there was a lot of even though there would have been trains, there's a lot of trains and there was a lot of schooners going back and forth. So a lot of the folks, there's a lot of cultural exchange then. But anyway, so this recipe is called okra gumbo. And I'll talk about the steps in a little bit. But the thing that was fascinating is they got like 6 or 7 recipes in there. And they're both filet gumbo and okra. And so folks who aren't familiar with filet, it's the sassafras leaves that have been dried and pounded. And so this recipe is specifically okra gumbo. But when you see a lot of okra gumbos today, at least what I've seen, it's usually seafood and okra. And then it's usually chicken and filet chicken. And then nowadays, both of them have a roux. But this was fascinating because the ingredients were totally different from what you were expecting. So I'll go through it real quick. And what it was is you start off with a whole chicken, and then you cut it up, and then you got like about a pint of okra and maybe a little bit of tomatoes diced up, and flour enough to dust, and salt and pepper and boiling water. So those are the main ingredients. Oh, and an onion. There's no celery. There's no parsley. There's no bell pepper. And so you flour that chicken, you put it in a little grease and just brown it. And while it's browning, you throw some onions in it, let those brown, throw your okra in it that you've chopped up, let it brown. And then once it's all browned, you throw that boiling water on top, throw in about the chopped up tomatoes, and you let it boil or simmer for 3 hours. And then when it's finished, you adjust the seasoning with salt and pepper. And I was very skeptical, as you can probably imagine from, we talk about gumbos on other episodes.
Right.
And there's no Trinity. There's no garlic. There's no roux in the traditional sense.
Right.
And so I'm thinking, this is going to suck. And so I made it. And then as I kept watching it and smelling it, and I was looking at it, I was like, hey, it looks like gumbo. It's got that nice dark color to it. The flavors were very gumbo-y, and the thickness or viscosity of it was what I'd expect in a gumbo. It wasn't too thick. It wasn't too thin. And so what you'll see if you watch the video is that basically the tomatoes help kind of break down the okra, because okra, if anybody who cooks with it knows, it's slimy. But then the 3 hours of cooking really breaks down the okra. And so you get some of the okra seeds left. But at least 3 or 4 people tried it, and they all complimented me on it. I mean, it wasn't just like, yeah, it's good. It was really, they enjoyed it. So like I said, I think people ought to try it for themselves. And it's a lot less, really kind of an inexpensive gumbo. I mean, for $12, you get a pretty full-size gumbo. But
yeah, well, thanks for sharing that. And again, so the link will be, or it is down below. And so that'll go directly to your site. And remember that David is also part of the Royal Order of Gumbo. And, so he's got street cred, I guess is what I'm saying. And if his family eats it, then you can be assured that your family will as well. So, but okay, well, that's it for now. Until next time, folks, thank you for joining us, and we will see you around. Thanks, David. Take care.
Yep. Thanks. See you later. Bye.
Bye.